So now that we know how we interact with our chart from inside our TypeScript code, let's now draw something to the screen. We want to build a bar chart here in this module, so that's the final goal. And therefore, as a first step, I actually just want to render a rectangle, let's say. I want to render a square, I want to render some visual block onto the screen. And we can do this here with help of one library that already should be pre-installed, and that is the d3 library. Now, in case your dependencies in your package.json file look differently than mine, attached you find my package.json file, and you can then replace yours with it, delete your package.log.json file, and then, very important, if you did replace your package.json file with mine, quit this pbiwiz start process by pressing Ctrl+C multiple times, and then run npm install in your project folder. This will pull in all the dependencies specified in the package.json file and make them available in your code. Thereafter, restart pbiwiz start. So once you did that, you have the same dependencies as I do, and that is important because that includes the d3 package. And that is a package we're going to use now. Now the question, of course, is what is d3, or d3.js as it's also called sometimes? Well, d3 simply stands for data-driven documents, and it is a library that helps us with manipulating documents based on data. Now, a document in this context simply is our chart, for example. It basically refers to web pages, you could say, and as I explained, our chart is like a mini web page. So d3.js is a library that makes it easier for us as a developer to bring something onto the screen, potentially something visual like charts or bars or rectangles, stuff like that, based on data, and that is important. d3.js is a library that does not just help us with manipulating documents, but also with doing so based on data. That means that, for example, when the data changes and so on, d3.js makes it very easy to update what's on the screen. It also makes it very easy for us to scale things correctly, to make sure that our bars, for example, have the appropriate heights, depending on which data is appended to which bar. And that all is made much easier with d3.js, which is why we're going to use that library. Now, since it already is installed, we can go back into Visual TS and start using it. And here we can start using it by first of all adding a new import here. We want to import from d3, so from that package which was installed. And then we need to add curly braces here, and between those braces we need to specify what we want to import from d3. And from there we want to import the select function. The select function allows us to get hold of a DOM element, so of a document element, and then work with that element in the d3 world, so to say. In detail, that means that we're now able to call select here, so we execute this select command here in the constructor. And you'll see I'm getting an error here because select actually wants to know what it should select. And I want to select options.element. So I want to select that element which I'm getting here through the options parameter. So that chart space, that space where we can render our chart. So now we got hold of that in d3 world. And I'm saying it like this because now we can call a command on this selected element by adding another dot here. And now we got various commands here which are made available by d3. And here we can now, for example, call append, which is a method we saw earlier, but this is just a command that happens to have the same name. It is a different command. It does something differently. Here we now append a new element which we want to bring onto the screen. And we don't need to create that element first with document create element as we did a few minutes ago. Instead, here we pass in a so-called string, so some text, which we simply mark by having single or double quotes here, opening and closing. And between those quotes, you type svg. And this creates a so-called svg element, which is a default HTML element you can use in the end, and appends it here to that selected element. Now that will work, but we won't see much by just doing that. Instead, we want to render a rectangle. So therefore, I will again call a command now on this appended svg, and that's again the append command to basically add another element now to this svg. So the SVG is added to our root element, to our chart canvas, so to say. Then to this SVG, we add another element, and that should be a rect element. Rect is another default element you can add, and that stands for rectangle. So this will add a, you guessed it, rectangle. And now to configure this rectangle, give it a color and a size, we can call attr, which stands for attribute, on that rectangle. And this, by the way, is a concept which is called chaining, because we're chaining command after command after command. And the command always refers to the thing right in front of it. So attr refers to what's returned by this rectangle creation. So in this case, in the end, to the rectangle element. Now attr takes two parameters now, and the first one is a string where we describe the attribute we want to set, so the name of the attribute, and that, for example, would be the width. And then we can add a second parameter by adding a comma, and then the value for the second parameter, and that will be the value for this attribute in this case. So for example, 50, to give this rectangle a width of 50. Now, just the width is not enough though, so we can chain another command, because attr, thankfully, still gives us access to this rectangle, so we can call attr on attr. And here, I want to set the height, and let's say we also set this to 50 to render a square. Now all this code is getting a bit hard to read, so therefore I will actually split this into multiple lines here, which is something you can do. This was still one long command chain, it's just made a bit more readable. And then I'm going to add one last attribute here, and that is the fill attribute, which defines the color to which we want to set this. And I'll set this to red. Now we could also use the visual.less file for styling, but I will just do everything here right now so that we have it all in one place. Now if we save that, we can go back to Power BI Service and reload, and we see our red square at this point. If you don't see that, attached you find my latest code snapshot, and you can download it and compare it to your code or replace your code with mine to find out where your code differed and what could be causing this. So with that we have this square, but now to also see when exactly the update method does something, let's also make sure that this square becomes green if update runs. Of course, that's not the final goal of this module, but it's just something I want to do here so that we can understand when update gets executed. Now for this, we need to reach out to this rectangle again and just change its fill attribute. And that is easiest done by saving the rectangle or the SVG element in a so-called property of the class. Because data we set up here in the constructor can only be used in here. If we want to work with the same data in another method, in another command, we have to save the data in a so-called class property. And we can do this here by adding any name of our choice directly in the class, for example, SVG, and then add a colon, and then you define the so-called type. That's also something you see here after options, for example. After the colon, the type of the data you're getting or you're storing here is defined. And that is simply an extra hint to TypeScript, to the language we're using, so that it can verify if you are accessing, for example, properties or data on the received object that actually exists because you're working with the correct type. Now the type here for SVG is something we can import from d3, and we simply add a comma after select to import a second thing. And that's the so-called selection. So here we set this to type selection, and now this is a special type because this is a type which internally works with another type, because you do select some element of some type, and you set up such combined or related types by adding angle brackets after selection, and between the angle brackets you have the internal type of this selection in this case. And that's a SVG element, and you don't need to import this. Now as you see, I'm actually getting some red squiggly lines here, so my IDE is not fully satisfied. That is because we actually need to pass 4 types between the angle brackets. The other 3 types don't matter to us here though, so we can simply add a comma and then type any, and any. Any is a special type in TypeScript, which basically means any kind of data is accepted there. We're not going to work with that extra information, so that works for us. Now last but not least, we can mark this property as private, which means, for example, Power BI Service will not be able to retrieve that data because it's just some internal data we need in our code. Power BI Service will only work with these 2 commands. Data like this is just used by us internally in our code. Now, how do we use this property? Well, we can store our SVG element here by now simply saying this SVG. This simply refers to the class this constructor belongs to, for example. So we reach out to this SVG property here, and with the equal sign, we store a value in there. And I want to store this appended SVG. So I'm adding a semicolon here to end this command line here. And then to make it work again, I'll therefore call this SVG append here to then add something to this SVG. And then we can again format document. Now I'm doing it like this because now we have the SVG also available here in the update method. And we can then, for example, select our rectangle that we added in there again. So now I'm not appending it because we already did append it. Instead, I select it. And now we can set a new attribute here and set fill to green, for example, like this. And now whenever our rectangle, our square becomes green, we know that the update method must have executed. So back here, let's reload our visual, and you see something interesting. It's green right from the start. And that's a useful piece of information. The constructor runs when the chart is created, when the graph is created, but Power BI's service also immediately calls update thereafter. It will also call it later. It will also call it when your data changes. I can tell you that. But it will also call it right at the beginning. And that's just the default behavior. So therefore, we know that whatever we do in update will run right at the start as well. And that's good to know. The one important thing to keep in mind, of course, is that the constructor will only run once. So things like creating elements is something you might want to do in there. Unless you are, for example, creating elements because a new data point was added and you want to render a new bar. Updates to rendered data, so like adding or removing extra bars or changing widths or colors, that should be done in update, which unlike constructor will run multiple times. It will run once initially, but thereafter also whenever our data changes. And now with this newly gained knowledge, let's continue and let's work towards a real bar chart.